And that's why the Pullman Strike had a great impact on the history of Chicago. Wait a minute. If I'm going to do this right, I need to start from the beginning. George Pullman, a man who lived a life of great wealth, was an engineer and manufacturer who created the concept of Pullman porters. This concept started when Pullman hired former African American slaves to work for his company. This movement consisted of many ups and downs and eventually had a great impact on the civil rights movement in Chicago. It started when George Pullman had a vision. This vision later became a reality, and the first sleeping car was being invented. This provided sleeping arrangements that were comfortable for overnight travelers. It was more modern. Time passed, and when the year of 1860 rolled around, George Pullman decided to leave his career in Chicago and go to Colorado after catching at what the time was called gold fever. Eventually, Pullman returned in hopes of improving his business and focused mainly on upgrading the sleeping car. 1865 rolled around, and the sleeping car had been launched. The evolution of comfortable transportation was just beginning. Pullman had started a partnership with Benjamin Fields. However, this collaboration didn't last long. In 1867, the partnership had broke and they parted ways, Pullman later becoming the president of the Pullman Car Company. It was the year of 1879. The company was a success. With its luxurious furniture and quality, about $1 million in profit was made. So you may be wondering, what was it like to be a Pullman porter? Well, after interviewing my grandpa, I found out that they pressed and dry cleaned clothes, served food to passengers, and helped with luggage, as well as shining shoes and changing the bed sheets. They worked long hours, some only sleeping 3 hours out of the day. Times were great, and although porters only received a wage of $1 per day, they saved every tip they could get and eventually formed what was known as the black middle class. Pullman porters were hard workers and definitely earned what they deserved. However, others didn't always think so. A former Pullman porter by the name of Benjamin Gaines quoted that some passengers called all the porters by the name of George. Benjamin's response was, "My name is Benjamin Franklin Gaines. There's no George anywhere." Gaines later adding, "I think it caught them by surprise because there would be no follow-up insult behind that." No Pullman porter's life was glamorous, and often they were made a mockery of, from being caricatured in images to rude skits made on their livelihood. It was 1894. After the wages had fallen and jobs were being cut, the wages that were given were very hard to live through. Not to mention, the porters were forced to live in Pullman City, which was their own little community, where they had to take on any given workload and agree to any cuts made in their wages. But on June 29, 1894, history had been made. 50,000 men had quit their jobs to support the cause. People were stopping trains and ugly fights were breaking out in different areas. So why all of a sudden would 50,000 men, 30,000 being Pullman porters, randomly quit their jobs? This is where a man by the name of Eugene V. Debs comes into the picture. Originally from Indiana, Debs moved to Chicago and eventually, made aware of the porter's situation, wanted to help. He led the strike. Debs had gone to Blue Island, Chicago, and asked railroad workers if they'd support the strike. The workers did feel that they were being treated unfairly, and they supported Debs and began burning things and damaging other properties. Federal troops had to come in to prevent the strike. On July 2, 1894, an attorney by the name of Richard Onley had declared that the strike was illegal. But on July 10th, a few days after the strike had been declared illegal, Debs had been arrested with 3 other union leaders due to messing with U.S. mail. Debs had been released a few hours later and decided not to continue the strike because of federal troops interfering. Debs was later sent back to prison for 6 months, and people had lost all respect for George Pullman. Later on, Pullman demanded that his grave was to be lined with concrete to keep people from robbing him, and later he died on October 18, 1897, due to a heart attack, and was buried with plenty of concrete poured over his grave. Porters returned to work with their same wages, but it didn't matter because they had made a difference. This was the first strike to have needed help from federal troops, and this movement also proved that black men could have middle-class lives. And that's really why the Pullman Strike had a great impact on the history of Chicago.